Let's see how he came to be Sir Robert, because all of a sudden his fortunes changed. On the 4th of December 1642, Cardinal Richelieu died. On the 10th of January 1643, Moray, who had been Quartermaster General at Newcastle at the time, travelled down to Oxford where Charles had his court, reported the death of Richelieu and was knighted for his trouble. And he was then sent with a message to the King's brother-in-law in France, because there was a chance that the King of France, Louis XIII, would actually help support Charles against Cromwell. And of course you can't have a commoner taking royal messages, can you? So he got himself knighted. And off he trots back to Paris. Let's explore his period of imprisonment now. On the 14th of May 1643, Louis died. Unfortunately, at this stage, he hadn't helped Charles. The message had been taken, but Louis wasn't in a position to do anything being dead. The ruler became Louis XIV, who was only 4 years old. So effectively, Cardinal Mazarin was now running the country. Mazarin disliked Moray, because of course Moray had been one of Richelieu's people, so Moray fell out of favour. King Louis had promoted him. He was now a colonel in the Scots Guard, and he'd been sent on an expedition to Bavaria, and he was very unlucky. He got captured and he was imprisoned. Now they offered to ransom him. Mazarin said, "No, I'm not bothered, leave him there." So we leave him to rot in a Bavarian prison for a while. He returned to Mazarin's favour at a later date. On the 28th of April 1645, he was ransomed for the sum of £16,500 by Mazarin. That's a good few £1 million in today's money. So Mazarin had a real change of heart. Why? Well, he was actually sent to London, again as an agent for the French, to rejoin the Covenanters who were negotiating Charles I's surrender to the Scots. And guess who was leading the surrender negotiations? General Hamilton, who had initiated Robert Moray. The Masonic brethren from Newcastle were leading the Scottish delegation. Moray had strong links with them, so he was sent back as a French spy. He's a rather nasty piece of work, you might notice. He can be bought very easily, he can be discarded, but he's not afraid of being bought back. Let's see what happened next. Well, Charles got defeated at the Battle of Marston Moor, and he gave himself up to the Scots at Newark, which is a singularly appropriate place to have given himself up, if you think about it. Once you've realised the anagram, you can never pass through the station with equanimity ever again. It starts with a W, for those of you who haven't spotted it. The Scots sold Charles to Cromwell, and Moray, with overtones almost to the wind of the willows here, actually got the king to dress up in women's clothes, and got him he got a boat by the quay in Newcastle. He got the king in women's clothes, and he was about to smuggle him out when the king backed down, on the basis it would be unseemly to be caught dressed like that. That is not actually Charles I dressed as a woman, it's his daughter. But there's a family likeness there, so I put it up to give you a feeling of what he might have looked like. If he'd actually succeeded, he would have probably established a republic in England for all time. Because if Charles had run to France, there would never have been a restoration. We would never have had a constitutional monarchy. He didn't have the king's interests particularly in mind. Meanwhile, the Prince of Wales, whose feathers I notice are above your chair there, had escaped to France. We're now in June 1645. Let's look at what happens next. Charles was handed over to Cromwell by the Scots because the Scots actually hadn't been able to pay their army, so they sold him to Cromwell for the price of the back pay. And Cromwell paid it, then they could pay off their army and they could go back home. And Moray returned to Edinburgh with them. There's a few records of him being present at meetings of the Lodge of Edinburgh. One that particularly stands out is on the 27th of July 1647, when he was present at the initiation of brother William Maxwell, and the Earl of Lauderdale conducted that initiation. There's a lot of links now between Moray and Lauderdale. That's the Earl of Lauderdale. Moray returned to France, and he met with the Prince of Wales, and his role was to try and persuade the Prince of Wales to support the rebels in Scotland. And he delivered a formal letter from Hamilton and Lauderdale requesting the Prince to come to Scotland and lead a group of Stuart supporters. There was a lot of toing and froing, and a lot of haggling went on, and the prince finally did land there and did return to Scotland. But meanwhile, Charles I, there he is, sitting, being tried by the House of Parliament for treason. And he was found guilty, and of course he was beheaded on the 27th of Jan 47. So the result now, the Prince of Wales was the king-elect, but of course the monarchy had been abolished in England, but not in Jersey, so he was proclaimed in Jersey, and the Scots now wanted him to be crowned King of Scots at the traditional crowning place of Scone, because of course Oliver had now taken Edinburgh. He was proclaimed in Jersey in Scotland, and Moray negotiated with Charles on the behalf of the Earl of Lauderdale for him to be crowned King of Scots. Charles sailed for Scotland and was crowned at Scone on January the 1st, 1650, in a ceremony that took 12 hours in the open air, conducted on Moot Hill. The ministers of the kirk lectured him about the sins of his forebearers, and he agreed with them how dreadful they were. There's a long story there, but I'm not going to tell it now. Anyway, he was King of Scots now. But unfortunately, at this point, Charles was driven into exile by France because Oliver advanced. What's happening to Sir Robert? Well, he'd stayed in Scotland and he got married to Sophia Lindsay, sister of the Earl of Baclaris. And he was also organising an uprising against Cromwell. But he was actually then imprisoned for threatening to kill the king. This is the king he's just had installed as King of Scots. And he was believed, and he was put in prison, and eventually he was cleared. And there's a very interesting story, which I put in the write-up to the paper, where there's a lot more detail than the stuff I'm giving you now, where he made a very Masonic plea to Charles to assert that he was innocent. But his wife died in childbirth, and he, at that stage, became very withdrawn. He joined the king in France, and at this stage he started a very long series of correspondence with Bruce. Those letters survive, and in them he talks about the solace that he found in Freemasonry, the meaning of the symbols, and how these symbols affected him. There's no picture of Sir Robert, but that's a picture of his wife. That's Sophia Lindsay, who died in childbirth quite young. Anyway, forgetting the Civil War, let's come back to Restoration Britain, 1660. Charles was invited by General Monk to return. He became the first constitutional monarch of Britain, and he returned to a problem. He had a really weak navy, and there was a naval war threatening with the Dutch. The navy was run down, and Charles had no money. The Dutch had better ships, they developed faster, more manoeuvrable weapons, but William Petty had designed a fast manoeuvrable ship, sort of thing we'd call a Bermuda-rigged one now. He built this new type of yacht. He called her the Experiment. He beat the King's mail boat in a race from Holyhead to Dublin. He had a similar one built for the King's own use, and it was called the Greyhound. Now, Charles comes into the story a little bit. The King had the new yacht had been given fitted out, moored it in the Thames. He had it fitted out with a crimson and damask bed, a set of gilt leather hangings, and he used it to entertain his lady friends, such as Nell Gwynn. There's a photograph of Nell Gwynn, decks cleared for action. And Charles was restored to the throne of England in June 1660. So we're now talking not about years, we're talking about months. Moray returned to London after 10 years' exile in August. And during that period, he'd actually been spying, this time for Charles. He'd been to Maastricht. There's a record of him meeting with Everett, the leader of the Masons in Maastricht, taking the Masons' oath, and then spying out all the defences and reporting back to Charles. He came back in August. He was greeted by the King. He'd been back just 3 months when he founded this society in London. He's been away. He's not been in London. How on earth does he know all these parliamentary scientists? And how does he get them to come together with a group of royalists who had been fighting tooth and nail only a few months earlier? By November, and we're now talking about literally another 4 or 5 weeks, they've got a royal charter. They've got a royal charter that gives them the freedom to publish, gives them the freedom to carry out experiments, it gives them the freedom, basically, to publish whatever they choose in the pursuit of science. And that was one hell of a freedom to be given. Moray seemed to have an in to all sorts of top mathematicians. He brought in this man, the man who invented algebra. He brought in Seth Ward, who was one of the people who did the groundwork on the calculus. For the first meeting, the man Moray put in the chair was the person who couldn't have been further out of favour than anybody else. It was John Wilkins. You have to remember that 2 days before that meeting, the King had sat in the House of Lords where they passed a bill to dig up Oliver Cromwell and his co-conspirators, cut off their heads and stick them on a post outside the Palace of Westminster. So he was hardly a forgiving man. And yet, on the Wednesday, the brother-in-law of Oliver Cromwell was actually invited to chair the meeting. What on earth was going on? You need to remember that all the parliamentarians I told you about at the beginning of this talk were supporters of Oliver Cromwell. They'd all been done very well. They'd received preferment, they'd been promoted, they'd had very good jobs. So effectively, they were glad to work for nothing. Because if they didn't work for nothing, then they faced the same sort of fate as Oliver. You know, effectively, you're going to get hung, drawn and quartered and dragged through the streets of London. And that did happen to some of the other signatories of the death warrant. Within 3 months of returning to London, Moray had formed his scientific society.